vanilla. Sweet, suffocating vanilla in a house that was supposed to smell of cedar. They said he fired 5 people over candles. The tabloids made a week of it. The headline writers liked the symmetry of the number, the petty cruelty that fit the rumor. Sterling Vance, the man who built vast towers of money and named his estate Iron Mill as if to prove he could turn anything into something impenetrable, had stormed through a staff meeting like a winter wind and dismissed half the domestic team when someone, somewhere, had swapped small cedar-bark tapers for cheap vanilla tapers that left the library smelling like a bakery. It read like a scandal. It fit his image. The town loved it because it was simple. A billionaire's temper, a petty domestic slight, instant news. The truth was quieter and colder. Sterling didn't rage. He moved with the precision of someone who had practiced distance until it became a habit. Firing was a button he could press to keep surprise at a safe distance. People were less likely to hurt him if they feared what he might remove. He had learned that in fragments of memory that lived behind a spare, efficient wall. He'd learned it the same way he learned to count money, by isolating elements and refusing surprise. Vanilla indicated an intrusion. In a house where everything was arranged to be predictable, an unpredictable smell meant someone had altered his system. Iron Mill was an old textile factory repurposed into a vertical fortress of glass and stone and polished iron. The rooms were white with cool light. A mechanical hush persisted, punctuated by the soft thump of staff footsteps in hallways below. Sterling liked things to be clinical. Cedarwood candles burning a steady, dry line of scent. Towels folded in a way that announced competence. A bowl of cucumber water on the desk in the study for the single glass he allowed himself at dusk. It was safer that way. An ordered life could be controlled. Helen Marsh sat across from him in the staffing agency office with the kind of plain face that read, empathy, the way others read a list. "We can find someone who respects your preferences, Mr. Vance," she said, the small syllables measured. She had the folder of candidates, crisp and company-punched, and a patient competence that made people trust her. She did not watch Sterling the way the tabloids suggested. She watched him in a way that assumed people wore their worst parts until someone else noticed and pulled them out. "I don't want drama," Sterling said. He was always precise. "No staff who insists on visibility. I need someone who will be in the house and not in my life." Helen's fingers touched the folder like an offering. "We have a recommendation. Quiet, efficient. Doesn't like to be seen. I call her a ghost housekeeper, but she's more a steward. She keeps things as they should be. Ghost," he repeated. He liked the word. It suited his grammar. Invisible, efficient, no obligation. Helen gave him a name, Willa Chen. She spoke it with an index finger flick, the kind that tells a story in a single word. Sterling nodded. Names were tools. People were variables. He signed the paper with the imprecision of someone who signs things to clear space. Willa arrived with a small bag and the kind of quiet that feels like a folded letter. Purposeful. Unread. She wore a plain coat, fingers clean from work that made its mark elsewhere. Her hair was pulled back in a practical knot. When Helen explained the terms, no public introductions, no social appearances, a covert arrangement. Willa tilted her head as if measuring the fit. Her reply was a single line. "I can be unseen." That reply was the last human voice Sterling had invited into his domestic life for years. He answered with another formal nod and an instruction list that read like a manual for neutrality. Cedarwood candles, low amber bulbs in the sitting room, cucumber water in the study by 4 in the afternoon. No scented oils. No guests without prior notice. Willa agreed and took the keys. For a week, Sterling kept to his routines. He moved between meetings and rooms with the same economy of speech. He ate alone at a long table that served as a conference of one, and he read reports diagonally. The house changed around him without fanfare. It always took longer to notice the invisible things. He first registered it by smell. One evening, as rain skinned the windows in thin silver streaks, he entered the library expecting the dry cedar clarity and found something softer, slower. Vanilla was gone. It had never been put back. The cedar had returned. He looked at the candles with the suspicion of a man who considered accidental change a possible conspiracy. The taper wax sipped its flame with a dry, honest scent. The air felt less like an archive and more like a room that could sustain half a conversation. There were other small things. A tray by the study door bore a glass pitcher with 2 slices of cucumber and a wedge of lemon. The glass fogged slightly in the house's stale air, promising an improvised coolness that belonged to summer porches, not lobbies. The shirts in his wardrobe were softened in a way he did not ask for, but, in some secreted corner inside him, appreciated. Not fluffed into fashion, just pressed and folded with a precision that said someone had taken care to understand the angle of a shoulder. A bowl of plain chicken soup, exactly to the bland restorative recipe someone from a long-ago institution might make, appeared on the service tray at 12:30 one day, steam lifting like a small, polite apology. He did not meet the woman who made those changes. He never saw the hands that left the little bowl of soup, the service that moved like a tide through his rooms. She came and left in the interstices. After the staff shift ended, before anyone could register her presence on their way to bed. Willa became a rumor inside the house itself, an arrangement that minimized possibility and maximized function. To Sterling, she was the least desirable of attachments. To the house, she was a new, steadying rhythm. He reacted the way he always had, by cataloging. He had cameras in every corridor, not only for security, but because he preferred to watch life through a lens. It was cleaner that way. One afternoon, working through a stack of documents, he idly pulled up the hallway feed. A grainy vertical of the service stair curling darkly between floors. The camera angle favored the back of the house. The framed view excluded faces and made hands into gestures. She moved like a shadow with a shape. Willa's back was to the camera as she carried a tray of tea. For a few seconds she paused on the bottom step and set the velveteen rabbit, Sterling's old childhood toy, a detail he had never thought to ask anyone to remove, on the banister. It was deliberate, a placement that made whatever little choreography she followed become personal. Her hand was small on the rail, and in that moment turned toward the camera with a sleeve that slid back and revealed something at her finger. A ring, copper band, and a smoothed bit of sea glass, the color of a gray-blue bottle turned green by tide and sun. Sterling did not expect the sight to split something open. Memory is a brittle thing until it is moved. Then it can fracture with surprising appetite. The ring on Willa's hand was a ring he remembered making in a hands-on, clumsy way, with a 12-year-old's earnestness. He had made it on a rainy afternoon at Mercy House, where he'd been sent after his mother's last argument with the world. He had worked with copper wire and a bottle-bottom glass shard he'd found in a landfill near the shore. He had promised, in the way children make promises with the weight of finality they cannot sustain, that one day he would buy her a diamond and put it in a box with a satin bow. Willa had laughed and turned down the promise. She had preferred the simple copper ring with the tide-smooth glass because it fit her better. It fit the exposure of hope and need she carried. Seeing the ring again on a camera feed in his own house made him taste metal. His mouth went dry in a way surveillance had never achieved. He watched her walk away, the tiny sound of her footfalls swallowed by the microphone's grain. The camera, designed to reduce and rationalize, had done the opposite. It carried a small human line: copper, sea glass, wrist, movement. The name that went with the image, Willa, landed with the weight of that small promise. A memory unspooled. The Mercy House dining hall with its red linoleum floor and a chorus of voices. Sister Mary's hand on Sterling's elbow as if to guide him toward a kindness he had not cultivated. A girl with a bowl of soup who kept her hair in braids and laughed when he called her by the wrong name. He remembered making the ring with his thumb, and an awkward tool that bit into copper, and a piece of sea glass that he had found and hid in the pocket of his coat. He had told her in the blunt language 12-year-olds use, that someday she deserved diamonds. She had smiled like the sea could swallow promises as easily as it turned broken glass to jewels. He blinked and went back to the footage. On her wrist, the ring glinted like a signal. She adjusted a cushion, smoothed a coverlet, moved with a number of small gestures that read like memory work. She took the velveteen rabbit and carried it to a faded armchair near a sun window where a child might sit. She perfumed nothing and lit no showy incense. Her changes were moderate and purposeful, the sort that made things fit human hands rather than museum pieces. Sterling watched breathlessly enough to notice when she paused, glancing toward the camera and tilting her head as if she felt the surveillance like a presence in the room. For an instant, the footage offered a face in profile. Handsome, not in the way the tabloids used the word, but in the compact sense of something serious and wearable. Her cheekbones hinted at a life that had required work without complaining. She straightened and continued, and the shot went back to the corridor's grayscale and the hum of the machine. He shut the feed off. He did not call Willa. He did not ask Helen for the details beyond the fact that she had been hired on probation. He did not immediately demand face-to-face introduction. For 3 reasons that had become excuses: shame, habit, and fear. Shame because the boy he had once promised a diamond to had been someone who'd taken refuge in a house corporate philanthropy placed him in. It implied a life he had never chosen, and a debt he had not repaid. Habit because he had built a life in which attachment was an operational risk. Fear because the idea of being seen by someone who knew the boy he had been was incompatible with the armor he had made of himself. Instead, he started to test. The way one tests wine by dropping a piece of fruit in the glass and seeing what happens. The tests were small and private, designed to prove or disprove the terrible tenderness that had been reopened by a ring on a grainy screen. He started with the velveteen rabbit. It was a thing out of time, a toy with plush fur worn thin by hands and favors. He requested it be placed in the sitting room at the foot of the armchair where younger guests might sit. He watched the corridor feed for the arrival and waited, pacing in a way he had not done since youth. Willa found the rabbit, and, with the soft economy of someone who knew how to tidy memory rather than own it, set it by the window. Sterling felt his pulse chase a foreign rhythm. He left an old photograph on the piano in the music room the next evening. A candid, yellowed print of a summer at Mercy House. A younger Sterling with sunburned shoulders, and a girl with braids leaning on his arm as they both leaned against a railing. A single piece of sea glass sat at one corner like an exclamation mark. The photograph had been something he'd rescued from a box with too many old objects, and shoved away because he did not know where else to take the parts of his past that still stung. He placed it on the piano with a care that felt like offering up a secret. When the house settled again, he watched the feed. Willa saw the photograph. She did not touch it immediately, but she sat quietly in the music room for a long minute, as if the photograph itself made something in her feel the size of that single room. Then, with a slow, deliberate motion, she slid the picture to the mantel and left a folded peppermint candy on top, wrapped in a paper that caught the light. It was an answer without words. Sterling's hands clenched so tightly he wanted to throw himself across the room and ask simple, brutal things. Was it really her? Why did she not say anything? And then he caught himself in the same practiced silence that had been his companion for years. He was a man who avoided the spectacle of feeling. He catalogued the peppermint and made a list of its implications. Recognition, restraint, a refusal to use the past as currency. She had chosen the candied response instead of confrontation. That was the part that bruised him more than any imagined rejection. She had dignity. He tried tenderness by another method. There was a song that sometimes surfaced in his head, a chorus that Sister Mary used to hum while she washed up plates at Mercy House. It was a lullaby made of simple notes and a soft insistence about the day being done. Sterling had not hummed it in years. He put the song on a rotation that would gently play from the music room at random afternoon hours. The first time it played, Willa paused in the corridor like someone halting at the edge of a memory that could either open or close a wound. She didn't sing along. Later, on the stair feed, he watched her stop and press a hand to her mouth, as if to steady the sudden leaking of a private feeling. When the song had finished, she had smoothed a cushion as if a comfort had been spoken aloud and acknowledged. These were not proofs. They were tokens, and tokens tend to mean what the person arranging them hopes they will. For Sterling, they were a thinnest of maps, lines made by someone trying to retrace a coastline. Each response from Willa was minimal. An item moved, a candy left, a cushion smoothed. But the composition suggested a familiarity with the archive of his childhood that was not casual. She responded with restraint, never with accusation, as if she had kept something small and precious, not because she expected a return, but because it anchored her. He placed the bowl last. It was early autumn and the light in the kitchen took on a small premature chill that made people think of returning indoors. He had eaten his lunch at his desk like an efficient animal of habit. The bowl that arrived on the service tray at noon smelled faint and immediate. He had not asked for it, not asked. The spoon clinked against porcelain, and the broth carried a scent the house did not usually accommodate. Plain chicken soup, the sort of broth thickened with nothing but time and old bones and patience. It was the kind of soup that filled a room the way a hymn does. There was a hum behind its smell, something like mercy in the simplest sense of the word. He paused mid-spoon. The taste landed somewhere between home and a brick wall his life had been built against. He remembered Mercy House again, not as a single image, but as an impressionistic film. Children queuing for ladles, a woman with strong arms stirring a giant pot over an old stove. Sister Mary moving through the room like someone duct-taping compassion into a frayed world. When he called the service line to ask the name of the person responsible for the meal, they gave him nothing but process. The staff was anonymous on paper by design. Willa never signed for deliveries. The bowl remained a resonant truth on his tongue. Days conformed to this new pattern. A small intrusion, and then the ritual of watching. He learned the meaning of her little handings. The peppermint on a piano meant recognition. The velveteen rabbit near the window meant a careful return of something lost. The song hummed through the house meant a private language she acknowledged. The soup meant presence in a form he had never allowed himself to value. The ring, sitting like an urban breadcrumb on her finger in the camera's grain, kept asserting itself as the pivot around which reason orbited. He began to catalogue exceptions. She left the house's public spaces untouched. She never sat at the breakfast table. She never answered a direct question asked by another staff member without prompting. She steamed curtains and then moved away like a wind. She observed. She performed no emotional labor beyond the necessary care of rooms. She honed her invisibility as if it were a craft. He watched then with new curiosity and an old terror. If she was the Willa of his memory, then she was a person who had a childhood stitched to him like a seam he had either refused to see or had failed to mend. He had been brave enough as a boy to promise diamonds, and foolish enough to expect that such promises could be converted into adult currency by the simple fact of wealth. Yet the ring on her finger was a rebuke and a relief. She had kept what mattered to her, not the diamond he'd mouthed in a boyish vow. He did not speak to her. Not yet. For reasons that carried complicated half-truths, he kept his distance. He had, in the past, built walls so well that their climb required a kind of construction work he did not trust anyone to do except in currency payments. He had thought at the time of his adult life that money could purchase the things he could not make happen with his own heart. Forgiveness, intimacy, fellowship. But currency and heart are different materials. Copper and sea glass sat in the camera footage and argued that some promises had a memory stronger than contracts. He found himself unexpectedly terrified by the idea of being seen. He compiled his own list of explanations. He had not tracked her down in the years after Mercy House because he had been settling debts, managing emergencies, defending his solitude. He had been active and careful about not being who he had been. He had done what he believed necessary to ensure nobody could open him easily. It was cowardice to admit. It was also the truth. He had not tried because trying would have required a different sort of risk, one that allowed him to be small. Instead, he observed tenderness like an experiment. He let the house do the softening, and then watched to see who was behind the gesture. He became a watcher of hands. One rainy afternoon, the house quieted early, and Sterling found himself standing where the study window gave to the river. He had, until then, treated the river as a neutral boundary, a line that marked the edge of his city's human life and permitted him to watch without being watched. He drank from the cucumber water glass and thought of nothing in particular. A photograph to a friend would have been unadorned. To him it was a landscape of causes. The ring felt like a missing piece of proof that real things had happened and persisted despite his renunciation. It is a strange thing to be undone by the smallest of objects. A child's ring, a piece of sea glass. An old man can be unmoved by bankruptcy but moved by jewelry. Smallness has a capacity to show up and reorganize grief. He decided finally to test further but with less duplicity. He left an old mildewed ribbon book at the bottom of the staircase where Willa was likely to find it. Inside the book, in a written scroll he had not read in years, was a note he had written as a child. To W. Keep this. We are both brave. He slid it into the pages like a little trap for memory. She found it 2 days later. He watched her in the camera frame as she opened the book, thumbed the note, and then, with a quick, efficient movement, tucked it into a drawer of a desk in the little office off the paneled room. She did not call him. She did not leave a message. When the music room played the lullaby again, she hummed the second line under her breath, as if acknowledging the memory without inviting him to share it. It was an answer, not a conversation. That was the pattern that frightened him. Every time he laid a breadcrumb, she took it and did not feed it back. The withheld conversation indicated dignity and maybe the most painful kind of patience. She was not using the past to bargain. She was not playing him. She was preserving the piece of herself that had once linked to him, and in doing so, she made a demand he had never planned to meet. To become someone who could be seen. He found himself cataloging his own cowardice with the same efficient cruelty he used on anyone else. He had been the sort of man who cleared people from his life when they presented the risk of being known. He had been comfortable with his own absence because absence felt like safety, and safety felt like the only way to survive a world that had never felt secure. But safety had a cost, and cataloging costs in his head was something he did well. The tests were not meant to be theatrical. They were a way of putting his palm to the glass of what might be true. He wanted to know if she would keep the ring because she had promised herself to it, or because she wanted to use it to stir something in him. Each modest response from her suggested the former. She was not an opportunist. She placed a peppermint on his piano and left a rabbit by a window and hummed a song. She fed a bowl of soup without announcing it to the world. Everything she offered was given with dignity and returned with restraint. That restraint, in him, fermented into a strange, aching respect. He began to see how small acts could be larger than any public confession. In the rooms warmed by the cedar candles she had reinstated, the tenor of the house altered. The house itself softened. Cushions relaxed into the lines of a body. Small houseplants found light on a sill. A photograph leaned against the mantel. None of it changed his position in society. Nobody in the papers would notice an hour spent steaming curtains. But within the geometry of his days, the changes were seismic. He did not tell anyone. He did not allow someone like Margaret Wellington, his publicist, a woman who could spin any private detail into a managed narrative, to know about the invisible woman at his hand's edges. Margaret's world was not for soft things. She wanted headlines and narratives and tidy arcs, where in the third act, the billionaire showed heart. Sterling, who had bought privacy by trading away messy intimacy, was not ready to explain the difference between headline-friendly redemption and the slowness of being seen. For reasons he did not entirely compute, he began to tidy around the edges of his own life. He straightened old photographs and wrote small notes in his head about apologies he might not make. Where once the iron-hard geometry of his days left no room for small mistakes, he started to leave windows ajar in a literal domestic way. A book on a table face down, a half-filled teacup, a sweater hung over a chair. He wanted the house to bear traces of life, even if part of him still practiced being a closed system. At night, he would watch the camera feeds and catalog with an efficiency that felt almost surgical. He would note what she moved and what she left alone. He wanted to be sure that if he ever claimed the past had touched him, the claim would not be based on a single moment of sentiment. He wanted to earn the memory of being called Willa's friend. There was one test he did not set. He did not demand her name spoken in the open, the way a man sometimes insists for fate to prove him right. He understood that a name can be both ownership and gift, and he was, ledger in hand, trying to determine whether she had kept a small object because it mattered to her, or because it tethered her to a childhood in which he had been something other than the man he had built to be. And yet the ring persisted. It was not dramatic. It did not shout in the camera grain. It sat on her finger, and it haunted him for reasons he could not abide. He took more watches. He walked through the house at odd hours, and listened for a kettle that was not his, for footfalls that did not belong to hired staff. He found himself once, standing in the hallway outside the kitchen as she worked, distant as the sound of someone who had walked into his life by mistake. And the smell of the soup rose like a signal. He wanted to meet her then, to ask simple things that would expose him to being unmade. He stepped back instead, retreating into the safety of the tower's perimeters. Then, one evening, a coy little administrative shift happened. A charity event was announced, a gala that some weekly philanthropic foundation hosted annually, in a ballroom where chandelier light would make the world shine in a way that encouraged people to misplace their better judgments. Sterling had no intention of attending. The gala existed for people like Margaret Wellington to parade contrition, and for publicists to smooth the rough edges of fortunes. He noted its date because everyone noticed the same calendar, and because his world was a network of events that must be accounted for. He did not plan to make a spectacle of himself, but to the house the date was another sort of pressure. Invitations would be printed. Staff would talk in corridors about black ties and long table settings. The household schedule would be calibrated to meet a social code. He did not like the idea of Willa being part of a scene that required visibility. He did not like the idea of anyone touching the ring that had, in its quiet way, moved him. He had by then imbued the object with a gravity he did not deserve to ascribe. After weeks of patient watching, Sterling sat in his study in the late blue hour, and the ring came back into his thought like a soft, persistent tide. He had not spoken. He had not made a move. But the room felt changed by the presence of small human things. A rabbit perched where a shadow softened the emptiness. A cloth being used enough to show a hand's passage. He finally understood, with a clarity that tasted like cold iron, that the only way his life had ever been less lonely was through small shared rituals. The ring had reopened the possibility that another person's presence could be the architecture of a life, rather than a scandalous addition. He did what he had so carefully avoided. He called Helen Marsh, and, because business before intimacy felt like a safe compromise, asked about the idea of adding a public-facing event to the house schedule. "We have a gala in 2 weeks. he said into the phone with the exact voice he used for acquisitions. He did not say why he was asking. The question was neutral. It was a way to create a reason for people to gather in a place where he could not wholly orchestrate what happened. Helen's voice came back careful and efficient. "We will handle the staff, Mr. Vance. If you decide to attend, we can limit exposure." "But why?" "Because some of those events end up in rooms where people touch what doesn't belong to them," he said, the words less flamboyant than the man himself might normally make in public. "I would prefer this house be treated with discretion." It was a small maneuver, socially antiseptic, calling a planner to ensure a problem did not become a spectacle. Underneath it was a thin desire to be present without making spectacle of himself. He knew, with a slow admission, that if something had to break his armor, he would prefer to do it by the methodical hand. He ended the conversation and sat with the bowl of soup that had operated like a signpost for weeks now. He felt tired in a way that had less to do with fatigue than with the recognition that his careful defenses might finally be insufficient to keep history at bay. He had kept away from the world with the conviction that absence was protection, but the ring on a woman's hand shown in the grain of a camera suggested the possibility that avoidance had only left him empty. The tests had given him answers that were not simple. Willa was not manipulating. She was not bargaining. She preserved something small. His observation had changed the nature of his life, but it had not yet bridged the simplest need: to speak a name and be met with a name in return. He did not yet know what that would look like. He did not yet know if he could withstand being seen as the boy he had been. He only knew that the house, which had hitherto been an exhibition of restraint, had begun to accumulate human things. A bowl cooling on a table, a photograph tucked into a drawer, a rabbit by the window, a candy left like a coin of acknowledgement. The world outside Iron Mill continued its immediate business. Stocks rose and fell, a rumor dug itself into a new headline, and then was replaced. But inside his fortress, a small ring, and a woman who made herself a ghost, had made something irreducible loose. For a man who had practiced distance his entire adult life, the looseness was terrifying, and, in an odd economy, exhilarating. He catalogued the fear the way he had learned to catalog numbers. Neat, efficient, contained. He stood from the window and walked through the house at a pace that was not the mechanical drift of a man who avoided feeling, but the tentative step of someone coming back to a room he had once been allowed into. He paused at the music room and noticed the piano open like a vertical secret. On the lid of the piano sat the peppermint he'd left earlier, now a small film of condensation gathered on its wrapper. The rabbit beyond the window bobbed in the light. The ring, somewhere on Willa's hand, was beyond sight at the moment, but not beyond the record of the camera. He felt something that was not a plan yet, only a pressure forming like the first hour of a storm. The ring had rearranged his attention, set the collision of past and present on an axis he had not authorized. It made him aware of his cowardice in a way his wealth had never done, because money could never buy back what had been lost in childhood. Safety, an easy laugh, a shared soup. He sat down and wrote nothing. He made a list of things he thought he could do. Meet her formally, ignore her completely, ask Helen to transfer her elsewhere, buy the photograph and hide it, resign to the knowledge and do nothing. None of the options felt honest. None sat well in his chest. The rain began to quicken outside, and the house took a different sound. The kind where drops made a slow timbre of percussion across metal roofing. In the sitting room, a flame burned its steady cedar wick, and the light turned the surfaces of the room into small private flames. He thought of a promise made on a rainy afternoon, and how promises given by children were silly, because children do not yet know what it means to sustain the promise as a life decision. He thought, too, that perhaps Willa had made a different kind of choice. Not to wait for his return, but to keep what she had for herself. He left the study without a decision, and stopped by the camera monitor again. On the feed, Willa appeared, moving a vase of flowers a few inches to the right, so that the sunlight caught the petals like the inside of a coin. She did not talk. She never did when she thought herself observed. She moved with a property that was not uncertainty, but caution. Her fingers brushed the rim of the vase and lingered for a breath. When she looked up, it was somewhere else, but not at the camera. For a long second she seemed to notice the grainy eye on her. Then she smiled as if at a private joke and turned away. Sterling watched her walk away, and for reasons he did not parse, he felt the current of his life shift. He had seen the ring. He had seen the small, consistent axe that refused to force his hand. His chest tightened with the realization that the person on the camera had not come to make him whole, but to steward his house and, perhaps, to keep a piece of the past that mattered to her. He drew his chair to the window and let the idea of a future that included small bowls of soup and copper rings settle in his mind like an irritant. To protect it would require surrendering more than he had ever willingly given. To risk being the boy who failed to act. To risk showing fear. To risk humility. He had spent a career preventing vulnerability by buying distance. Now a child's ring and a ghostly housekeeper were asking him to buy a different kind of currency. Attention. He did not yet know if he could pay. He only knew that for the first time in years he had decided that avoidance was no longer a viable strategy. If you love stories where ordinary objects become promises kept and people find ways back to each other, stay with this one. There's more coming that shows what happens when a man chooses humility over armor. The days after that were quiet in a way that felt like waiting. Sterling watched the feed and continued the tests, small and unflashy. He left a carefully folded handkerchief on the back of a chair and found later that it had been ironed and set where the light would catch it. He registered a sip of water on his desk, left exactly as he had left it, and later poured into it a scintilla of lemon. When the house hummed at night, the warmth felt different. Less like a vault, and more like a home that had been taught how to breathe. A week bled into another. Invitations for the gala came and went, unremarkable in their arrival. But the world outside the glass seemed less pressing than the motion of a woman's hand. Sterling's close friends offered their opinions in private. He should use the gala to be seen as generous. He should make a public gesture to change the story of the candles. All of them. All of them offered counsel that felt performative. Margaret's brisk plans for a photo-op. Friends who proposed gestures that fit the tabloid's appetite for tidy redemption. They wanted a speech, a foundation check, an award with his name on it. Sterling listened, hearing only the white room of his life echoing with everything he'd been taught to value. None of their fixes addressed the small private weight that had settled beneath his ribs. Still, he agreed to attend the gala. He told himself it was a practical choice. He would be careful, stay near the wall, watch from a distance. He wanted the house to be presented with courtesy. No clumsy servants, no bottles of cheap wine on polished linens. He told Helen precisely how to staff the evening. People trained to be almost invisible. Attendees escorted by stewards. He thought of his decision as a way to shield Willa from being exposed. But he also knew a private part of him was prepared for something to break, either because of courage or because of the fragile inevitability of public rooms. The charity event filled the Iron Mills ballroom with a light that had no memory, a shimmer that made metal look confessionally clean. Chandeliers hung like pale constellations. The room hummed with soft laughter and the considerate clink of cutlery. Men and women in dark suits and silk dresses moved like a school of practiced fish around low tables. Cameras dotted the periphery, lenses set to catch the carefully constructed moments that made a man like Sterling useful to the world again. Willa was assigned to the service corridor. She moved through the back corridors, not as an afterthought, but as a practiced keeper of things, making sure trays were balanced, that napkins were folded in the same way they had been folded for years, that each pin of light in the private alcoves looked as if it belonged there. She was as invisible as she had promised to be. A presence that steadied the room. Eleanor Whitmore, lit in a way that made her laughter look obligatory, nursed a wineglass in a flair for mischief that liked to land on the thin skirting between spectacle and cruelty. At some point that evening, Eleanor decided to stage herself as the center of the dance. Wine was drunk for the effect of being unwanted in the right ways. Conversation was lavish but light. She drifted from table to table, practicing the art of being remembered. When she reached the service corridor to make an ostentatious show of kindness to the staff, handing a napkin to a server, patting a tray like the back of a dog, her motion landed on Willa. Willa was steady. She did not perform for attention. She moved a tray aside, returning a clumsy bow of thanks with a small nod. Eleanor reached for her wrist in a gesture that belonged to a world where people thought property extended to other people's bodies. The contact was showy, deliberate. The social laugh that had accompanied her hand turned to surprise as the ring slipped under fingers and clattered to the floor. The sound of the ring on stone was absurdly loud in the corridor. Sterling, who had been hovering at the edge of the room because of a misplaced curiosity he would not yet name, heard it and felt the same metallic ferocity that had hit him in the grainy camera feed. He had never seen anyone touch Willa except through the lens of a surveillance camera. He had never seen a stranger lay a hand that presumed ownership against her flesh. Everything in him compressed to a single line of response. He moved without the careful rehearsals of his old life. Perhaps the wealth that had taught him to micromanage an empire did not teach him physical speed, but it did teach him a kind of calculated extremity. He stepped forward, palms open, and for the first time in years performed something that was neither guarded nor marketable. He knelt. It was a small, shocking motion in a room where every posture had its cost. He reached and picked the ring from the floor. He pressed his thumb lightly to the sea glass, wiped it on his sleeve as if cleaning the memory itself, and looked up with a face that the room did not know how to read. Eleanor's laugh tripped into a sharp disbelief. Someone swore, startled, as the breath between guests contracted into the privacy that embarrassment made. Cameras pivoted, because cameras are machines built on appetite, and the lenses caught the photograph they all presumed they could chew on. A billionaire kneeling in the presence of a staff member to retrieve a cheap ring from the floor. He could have done anything then to satisfy cameras. He could have delivered a speech, signed an oversized check, made the evening about his mercy. Instead, he spoke in a voice that had the flat, clean edges of someone not used to excess. If you insist on buying touch, buy my house. Buy the keys, the doors, everything I own. Take it all. But do not think money makes you entitled to the right to touch what she keeps. His words landed like a minor scandal. He said them with a reserve that made them sound less like a challenge and more like a ledger entry. Precise, undeniable. Cameras ate them up. The room shuffled, as if a blade had been run along its polite cloth. Eleanor's smile split into something brittle. People inclined their heads toward Margaret Wellington, whose purse tightened in a motion that felt like damage control. He extended the ring between his fingers. Not as a show, but as a return. Willa's hand was steady when he met it to her. He said her name. Quiet, deliberate, like the thing he had not wanted to sound was finally given permission to be uttered. Willa, he said, and the single syllable measured itself against a suite of unsaid apologies. Then he rose and walked away, the motion of retreat as decisive as the kneel had been. The crowd filled the space he left with speculation. Cameras replayed the moment until its edges went dull. Tabloid headlines the next day could make it into any number of stories. A billionaire's temper, then a billionaire's show. But for many who saw the footage, the visual became less about him than about the tiny object he had guarded. A piece of copper and tied smooth glass that became a fulcrum for the question the room could not answer. What happens when intimacy collides with wealth? Willa went home after her shift. She sat at the kitchen table in her small rental and wrote a letter on plain paper. She did not write with flourish. She wrote as someone setting a boundary. The letter read like an explanation and not an entreaty. Gratitude for the work, for the steadiness of the house, for what she'd been allowed to do. A refusal of spectacle, a desire not to become an exhibit, a statement that she would be leaving to preserve the quiet that had kept something of herself intact. She left it on the mantel, neatly folded, with the velveteen rabbit tucked in the margin as if the toy itself were a witness. Sterling read the letter the next morning when a housekeeper placed it, as any sensible person would, where a man who read everything might find it. The lines were spare. She did not beg. She did not issue a demand. She thanked him for letting things be and told him that dignity required removal from a room where she'd become an object of curiosity. It felt like an extraction. He felt the loss like a bruise. He could have let it stand. He had a life ready with deferred responses and clean delegations. Instead, he did something he had not done in private or public for decades. He moved fast and small in the world without consulting his advisors. He left a page of plans unwritten, shoved a scarf into his coat pocket, and stepped into the city as if his feet could outrun the architecture of his old cowardice. He found her not in a place of spectacle, but in the city's small, foggy precincts, where people who were not on calendars practiced their own quiet lives. She stood at the edge of a municipal park, counting change by the motion of feeding birds, the velveteen rabbit peeking from a canvas tote. When she looked up at the sound of approaching footsteps, she did not flinch. People like her do not startle easily. Their lives have taught them how to reserve surprise. Sterling's confession began before he found words that were new. "I watched," he said, because the truth had a way of arriving without ornament. "I watched and I did not speak. I thought—" He stopped, the sentence choking on a decade of avoidance. "I thought watching was enough." Willa listened as if he were a wind that had finally hit ashore and decided whether to gather in its wake. He told her then, in a way that the cameras never could capture, that he had looked for her off and on for years, and had not acted because he had been afraid of what it would mean to be small. He said aloud, clumsy, earnest, that he had been a coward, and that to have seen her on his monitors had revealed a boy he did not like, but one he could not deny. She let him say it. When he finished, the city breathed around them like an audience with better taste than those indoors. He reached into his coat and produced a small velvet box. It was not the kind with satin, not the kind that belonged to engagements that were spectacles. He opened it not to produce a gem, but to offer a coil of copper wire neatly wound around a little spool. And beside it, a pair of wire cutters, whose handles had been wrapped in tape. He laid the box on a park bench with the reverence of someone returning an object that had proven to be a teacher. "I can't unmake the years," he said, "but I can sit and learn. I can buy a hand a different thing, a hand that knows how to shape rather than only to possess. Teach me. Let me try. If you will not let me buy back what I promised when I was a boy, let me earn the shaping of the thing now." She studied the wire and the cutters as if they were evidence. Then she did something that would make better reporters into better people. She laughed. It was not a large laugh, but something caught and irrepressible, like sunlight finding a gap in the clouds. Tears gathered at the edge of her eyes, but her laugh had the clarity of someone who had not expected the offer and had not been prepared for the humility of it. "Why wire?" she asked. Half a question, half a test. "Because it's honest," he said. "Because I can't give you diamonds for favors, and I refuse to pretend that anything I spent matters when what I want is to learn how to not be made of armor." She handed him the cutters as if bestowing a small sacrament. Her fingers brushed his in a motion neither theatrical nor flinching. The touch was brief, an acknowledgement. She did not immediately agree to more than a beginning. She asked him a question that belonged to someone who had kept herself whole. Are you ready to make something for the sake of making it? Not to be seen, not to be photographed, but because the work is its own reward. Sterling, surprised at how loudly his chest answered, nodded. The street became the first lesson. Copper does not yield easily to inexperience. He learned to bend wire, to fold it around a puddle of sea glass, to hammer the edge with a small, ungenerous mallet. Willa taught him not with lectures but with small corrections. Hand positioning, the rhythm of breath when you file edges, the patience of waiting for copper to show its willingness. He made mistakes, cuts, misaligned coils, but he kept at it because the practice demanded honesty. He came back to the iron mill not as a man presenting an outcome, but as one who had a new apprenticeship in his hands. He began to spend time in the bench room where modest rings earned the label of craft. He traded meetings for afternoons, shaping copper, and in so doing, traded the clean currency of his old life for the messier reward of becoming someone who could be seen. The reconciliation was not a cinematic leap into a final embrace. It was a series of small mornings. He learned the precise way to make a loop. She taught him how to smooth a notch so it would not bite at skin. They sat in a small workshop space one afternoon, varnish and metal dust in the air, when she slid the original sea glass ring back onto her finger. She did so without ceremony. The motion was ordinary and tender and therefore monumental. 1 year later, the house had not been remade overnight, but it had been allowed to soften into the trace of a life lived by 2 hands, rather than 1. Iron Mill kept its structure. Glass and iron still framed the view of the river, but its rooms bore the signatures of domestic practice. A line of photographs taped to a pantry door, the velveteen rabbit in a low chair where the light hit it like a small altar, a bowl of chicken soup cooling on an end table because they had the kind of mornings where soup tasted right before noon. Sterling made fewer public pronouncements. Margaret Wellington still advised, and sometimes she still made selections for his public calendar. But her suggestions had lost their ability to steer the slow, insistent changes that had taken root. Plant life took windows more seriously than in the past. Cushions creased with the history of bodies. A hymn hummed sometimes in the kitchen when Willa was working, and he was learning a new turn of wire. They wore matching copper bands. Not identical, because nothing they made was in search of perfection, but complementary. His ring bore a small hammer mark she had taught him to make, a sign that it had been handled, corrected, and then chosen. Hers kept its sea glass, but there was now an additional curl of copper that made it sturdier and less secretive. When they raised their cups in the evenings, their bands made a small muted sound, metal on metal, an honest clinking that did not demand an audience. The bowl of soup that had once felt like a salted key to an old door became habitual. On a gray afternoon when rain scored the windows like the gentle insistence of some old hymn, they sat across from each other with identical bowls. Sterling stirred the broth with the back of a spoon and tasted it as if cataloguing. He did not speak with the countenance of a man making public declarations.